Earlier we talked about capitalist industrialization in 2 lectures. On capitalist industrialization, we talked about some of the aspects of the capitalist industrialization. So today we will continue with some of the more aspects which are associated with the capitalist industrialization, as well as ideas which have been given by some of the thinkers with regard to this kind of a development in the modern world history. And as we are aware that how industrialization in various parts of the world played an important role in the growth as well as development of the various economies, and how this rise of industrialization was basically seen in the framework of bringing about a lot of changes in the lives of the people, whether social, economic, cultural. So, we will try to understand some of these aspects which are associated with the developments which happened in the world economies at that point of time, and some of the thinkers, those who talked about these kinds of aspects. One was Karl Marx, and how he talks about the transition from feudalism to capitalism, and it was never a major preoccupation for Marx in that sense, and the Engels as well. And this we also discussed in our earlier lecture as well. And I would like to repeat some of the aspects which we talked about in the last lecture, so as to bring about some kind of a continuity in that particular framework. And so we find that it was nonetheless a problem which was addressed periodically in the discussions of the more central themes, and these are such as the historical materialist method, capitalistic mode of production, or the class conflict in history. So we find that these themes, they were an important concern in Marxist writings, and how Marx and the people, those who are associated with Marx, those who are seen as Marxist scholars, they have talked about these kinds of aspects, whether it relates to the class conflict or to the capitalist mode of production. And we find that how, when you talk about capitalism, when you talk about the capitalist development, how it was a very powerful kind of a development at that point of time. And as when you talk about the mode of production, then the capitalist mode of production definitely played an important role at that point of time. And it was also connected to the growth, in that sense, the economic growth. And the earlier models, whether you see it in the slave mode of production, where we find that technology was used in a limited manner, but in the capitalist mode of production, we find that the introduction of technology definitely played an important role at this point of time. And when we talk about Marx, he attributed its appearance not to the release of the natural unchanging human predispositions, but to the specific economic, political and legal measures. And when you see the society of that particular period, then we find that the kind of changes which came in the society, and how society was also ready to bring about these changes, this kind of a predisposition in that sense definitely played an important role. And when we talk about how Marx has tried to see it, then we find that the emergence of capitalism had two broad perspectives, and these perspectives, they have been offered by Marx. And he first emphasizes the corrosive effect upon the feudal system of mercantile activity and the growth of a world market and a new expanding cities as well. So we find that how the feudal system of mercantile activity which was there, the kind of changes which came during that point of time, and how there was the growth of the world markets at that point of time. And when you talk about the world markets, we find that how the geographical explorations of that particular period, where we find that how European traders, they came to India, and these traders, they took a lot of material out of India to trade to their own countries. And we find that over a period of time, they engaged in taking a lot of raw materials out of India especially, and from the Asian world. And we see that this kind of an activity, where we talk about capitalism, we talked about the three phases of capitalism. In the Marxists, they have talked about the mercantile capitalism, industrial capitalism, and finance capitalism. So they see these kinds of capitalism and the kind of changes which came in the different kinds of capitalism which were there. And when you talk about mercantile capitalism, then we see that how the initial dynamic was provided towards capitalism by the mercantile capitalism, and how they entered the production and they employed the wage laborers as well. So these were the important aspects which were there with regard to the mercantile capitalism. And when the wage laborers they came into the picture, then we find that some of the issues with regard to the kind of welfare which was concerning the wage laborers, these kinds of issues, they were also being talked about. And another variant which is being talked about, the second variant, is evident especially in the capital, and it centers on the producer and the process whereby the producer, whether the agricultural producer or in the craft sector, so how they become merchant and capitalist as well, where we find that the people, those who were producing, and these producers, they donned the role of the merchant as well as the capitalist as well, and over a period of time they increased their holdings to such a level that they became bigger producers. And when you talk about Marx, then he regards latter as a really revolutionary path to capitalism, since this kind of a transformation transforms organization and the techniques of production as well. So he sees that how the producer who is there, and this producer in a way also plays an important role, because the organizations, the kind of changes which came in the organization, and as well as when you talk about the techniques of production, then they also saw a lot of changes because of this. And we see that when you talk about the mercantile activity, then it may well turn the products for use into the commodities for exchange, but it does not explain how and why the labor power should itself become a commodity. So these kinds of criticisms, they have also been given, they have also been talked about, that how over a period of time the products which were being used, they were not for only consumption, but they were also being used as commodities for exchange, because this kind of a surplus was being created. And one thing which has been talked about is why the labor power it became a commodity in that sense during this particular period. And we see that although the merchant path separates the worker from the ownership of product, it retains the inherited techniques and social organization of production. So we see that how when you are talking about the merchant path and the kind of thing in which merchants they were engaged, then how the worker who was there, he was being separated from the ownership of the product, because he was just providing the labor. And we also see that when you see these kinds of techniques which are largely conservative in nature, and so they cannot in a way explain the transition to capitalism. And when one is talking about that how this kind of a transition takes place from feudalism to capitalism, then we find that when you talk about the primitive or the original accumulation of the capital, which is a concept which developed in the ideas which were given by Marx in his work Capital, and Grundrisse, which is the foundations, and to designate that the process which generates the preconditions of the ongoing accumulation of capital. So we find that the accumulation of capital was an important idea in that particular sense, and this accumulation of capital, we find that there was a lot of criticism because of this, that how the capitalists they were engaged in the accumulation of capital as the profit motive was their main motive. They wanted to secure as much as profits for themselves. And when you talk about the Marxist thinkers, when you talk about Marx himself, then we find that primitive accumulation is nothing else than historical process of divorcing producer from the means of production. So we find that Marx very well in a way delineates or points out that when you talk about this idea of primitive accumulation, then he sees this in the framework of the historical process, where we find that the producer is being divorced from the means of production. He is no longer connected to it, and he also sees or focuses upon how one set of class relations, they become transformed into another. So we find that the focus of Marx is on this particular aspect as well, that how some kind of changes they come in the class relations as well. And when you talk about in particular that how it is that a propertyless class of wage laborers, proletariat, they become confronted by a class of capitalists who monopolize means of production. So this kind of idea of class conflict was there in his ideas, and we find that the people, those who had property, and the people, those who did not have property, they were in conflict with each other. The people, those who were referred to as the propertyless, they were the proletariat section of the society, and the capitalists on the other hand, they wanted to maintain their monopoly on the means of production. They wanted to maximize their profits in that sense. So we find that when you talk about Marx and his contemporaries, especially his contemporaries, they saw the capital as a result of abstinence and saving, and as the original source for accumulation as well. And for Marx especially, we find that the primitive accumulation is not an accumulation in this sense at all, and abstinence can only lead to accumulation if capitalist relations of production or polarization between a class of capitalists and a class of wage laborers are already in existence. So we find that when you talk about Marx, then we also see that this kind of polarization also existed during that time, where we find that a class of capitalists, they became one, and a class of wage laborers, they were on one side. So in this kind of a situation, we find that some kind of a conflict was very natural, which was very natural to bound to occur, when we will find that the capitalists, they are going to have their own monopoly. They are going to exploit the wage laborers. In that sense, they are going to maximize the profits. They would not provide such kind of working conditions which are necessary for the kind of production which was happening in the capitalist sector. And that is why we find that there was a lot of criticism in the initial part of the industrial revolution, where we find that the workers, they were made to work for more than 16 to 17 hours, and how women and children, they were also being employed in these factories. And there are novels which have described the conditions of these factories, which were not safe for the young children, those who were working, and the kind of thrust which was being given to the issue of work, where the workers, they had to work for 16 to 18 hours. That was one of the concerns which has been talked about with regard to industrial revolution. And when Marx is talking about the pre-capitalist relations of production, he says that they were largely agricultural in nature, and the peasantry had the possession of the principal means of production, because we are talking about the pre-capitalist relations, and the land capitalism can only be created by dispossessing the peasantry of land. So when Marx talks about capitalism, he says that when you take land out of peasantry, when peasantry is no longer holding the land, and the land is now with the capitalist who is establishing factories in these regions, then we find that such kind of a change which comes in the relations of production. And this kind of a transformation is also not good for the peasantry as well, when it is losing out its own land to the industrial sector. And when you talk about the origins of capitalism, we find they are to be found in the transformation of the relations of production on land, and the freeing of peasantry from the land is the source of wage labor both for the agricultural and the industrial capitalism. So, we find that how such kind of a transformation, where we find that how peasants, those who were working on the land earlier, now no longer holding their property, either they become landless, so either they are working as bonded laborers or they are attached to land as wage laborers. That also happened at different points of time. And so we find that this kind of a dispossessed peasantry was in a sense also playing an important role in the framework of becoming source of the wage laborers for the agricultural as well as industrial capitalism. And this brought a lot of changes in the different sectors of the economy in society. And when you talk about thinkers like Marx, first and foremost effect of the agricultural revolution in England, he says that it was to expropriate the peasant from the soil and established capitalist agriculture. So, Marx talks about the kind of changes which came in England, because we find that agricultural revolution is generally being seen as a precursor to the industrial revolution, and a lot of credit is being given to the in agricultural revolution in terms of bringing about changes in the industrial revolution, or the kind of arrival of the industrial revolution in Britain. So, we find that the kind of innovations which came in the agricultural revolution, and with these innovations we find that the productivity and the production both increased during this time in Britain. And because of the increase in productivity and production, we find that there was a lot of surplus which could be exchanged for gaining some kind of other commodities. And we also find that there was some kind of a spurt in the population growth. We find that the population growth was there, and when you were able to produce more, then the population would be able to sustain as well, because you needed more food grains for the sustenance of the increasing population. And we also see during this time that a new money oriented nobility and gentry, it forcibly enclosed domains common in the wasteland, consolidated the small farms into larger ones, and at time converted to pasturage as well. So, this kind of a movement, which is referred to as the enclosure movement, was also very important at that point of time. We find that because of the enclosure movement, we find big farmlands, they were being created. And when big farmlands, when they were being created, then we realized that it was comparatively easier to innovate on these bigger farmlands. Modern machinery could be used in these bigger farmlands, and it happened as well because new innovative methods which were being used during this time played an important role in terms of the growth in agriculture. And we see that this growth in agriculture was also in a way seen responsible for the changes which came in the industrial sector, or rather industrial revolution. And we see, when you talk about the capitalist farmers, how they grew from a differentiation of peasantry, and how the enclosure converted the property characterized by shared rights into the private property. So, this kind of a change also takes place during this time. This idea of the private proprietary in land was very important, and how this kind of a genesis of the capitalist agriculture, it contrasts sharply with the birth of the capitalist industry. So, we see that these kind of changes, or these kinds of contrasts, they do existed at that point of time, and how agriculture, it generated both its own capitalists as well as workers. And on the other hand, we also find that the urban crafts, they played a distinctly secondary role in forming either the pole of industry. And when you see these kinds of developments, especially in 17th, 18th century, largely 18th and 19th century, and then we find, because industrial revolution is attributed to a period which is the first half of the 18th century, and the changes in the agriculture, they came before that. And when you talk about agricultural revolution, how it supplied the laborers and the merchants, they provided advance money to employ them in that sense, and shaped markets in their which in their products were sold as well. So agricultural revolution in that sense was in a way also supplied laborers, because now we find that less number of people they were employed in agriculture, and many people they migrated from the rural areas to the urban centers, and how the merchants, those who had the money at their command, how they employed these agriculturalists, those who were being dispossessed of their land. And we find that it all definitely played an important role in shaping the markets, where now these kinds of products which were being sold in these markets. And we find when you talk about Marx, how the merchants they could foster the primitive accumulation by usury and crushing artisanal guilds, expanding markets and providing employment, or by investing profits. So we find that workers they had various or diverse kind of activities in which they engage themselves, and how primitive accumulation got some kind of a thrust by their measures, where they loaned money in that sense, or we also find that the artisanal guilds they were being crushed. Now they did not have that kind of a unity which was there. And when you talk about the markets, how these markets they expanded over a period of time, and how money or the profits which they were secured, they were also being invested. So we see that while Marx emphasizes the domestic causes of proletarization, he focuses primarily on international commerce in accounting for the genesis of the industrial capitalists. So this kind of an interpretation largely stresses the forcefulness, often genocidal and unevenness of the primitive accumulation. So we find that how Marx he had his own ideas in that sense, and how he tries to distinguish between the different spheres. So we will continue further about the capitalist industrialization in our next lecture. Thank you very much.